Okay, let's unpack this. Nearly 1,000,000 years.
Hmm.
That's the staggering length of human presence we're talking about when we delve into the history of the UK. It really puts things into perspective.
It truly does. I mean, to consider that sweep of time from the very earliest human inhabitants right through to, well, modern Britain,
Yeah.
it highlights the immense journey we're embarking on in this deep dive.
Exactly. Today, we're aiming for the big picture,
Yeah.
the complete story of the United Kingdom. We've gathered, well, a really rich collection of historical material,
Hmm.
and our mission, really, is to extract the vital threads that have woven this incredible narrative. We'll be looking at the shifts in politics, the evolution of society, the forces driving the economy.
Culture, the environment, the whole lot. We're here to guide you through this vast historical landscape.
Mhm.
We'll be looking at the key layers, connecting the crucial events and trends.
Yeah, and hopefully revealing some surprising insights, things that illuminate this long history.
Definitely.
Now, when you think about nearly 1,000,000 years of history, it can feel, well, a bit daunting, can't it?
Oh, absolutely. Overwhelming even.
But don't worry. Our goal isn't to swamp you with endless dates and names. We want to highlight the most significant and, yes, maybe the most unexpected aspects that truly explain how the UK became what it is today.
So let's journey back, right back to the very beginning. Explore those prehistoric foundations that kind of set the stage for everything that followed.
Precisely. We're talking about the period stretching from around 900,000 BCE
Mm.
all the way to the Roman arrival in 43 CE. What can we learn about this immense span of time?
Well, the earliest evidence we have indicates a human presence almost 1,000,000 years ago. Those remarkable footprint discoveries at Happisburgh.
Incredible.
Then you've got significant remains of Homo heidelbergensis at Boxgrove around 500,000 years ago, Neanderthals in Pont-Neuf Cave, and early Homo sapiens like the finds in Pavilum Cave.
Okay.
What's particularly striking, I think, is the sheer length of this period and how these early populations were shaped by dramatic climate changes. You know, those repeated cycles of glacial periods and warmer times.
It's almost impossible to imagine those ancient environments. And then around 6,200 BCE, a major geographical shift occurred, right? Britain gets cut off.
Exactly. Rising sea levels severed the land bridge connecting Britain to continental Europe, created the English Channel.
Right.
And this geographical separation, in a way, it nudged Britain onto a slightly distinct historical path compared to its mainland neighbors.
How so? Do you think that early isolation might have subtly influenced later cultural developments, for instance?
It's a fascinating question to consider. It certainly meant interaction required crossing water, which changes things.
So leaping forward hundreds of thousands of years, we arrive at the indigenous societies just before the Romans. Who are the main groups we should know about?
Primarily, we're looking at the Iron Age tribes. In what's now East Anglia, you had the Iceni.
Boudica's tribe.
That's the one. Then in Wales, the Silures, the Caledonian Confederacy up in Scotland, the Trinovantes in southeastern England, among many others. Their social organization was largely based on tribal loyalties, with warrior aristocracies holding considerable power.
And the Druids are often mentioned in connection with these societies. What was their role? They sound quite mysterious.
They certainly held a vital position. They were far more than just religious figures. They acted as judges, they were the custodians of knowledge, and their oral traditions were the main way of preserving history, laws, cultural understanding.
So no writing.
Not in the way we think of it, for preserving their core knowledge. This reliance on oral tradition means our understanding of them comes mostly from archaeology and, importantly, often filtered through the perspective of their Roman adversaries.
That's a crucial point. History is so often told by the winners, or at least illiterate ones.
Precisely. Roman accounts often paint them negatively, sometimes as part of their justification for conquest.
But even before the Romans, Britain wasn't entirely cut off, was it? You mentioned trade earlier.
Not at all. There were well-established trade networks connecting Britain to the European continent. We find evidence of Roman goods, things like wine, olive oil.
Really? Before the invasion?
Yes, reaching Britain, especially the southeastern tribes, even before Emperor Claudius's legions arrived. This points to existing economic links, a degree of interaction already happening.
So those connections were already in place. And you can see how geography was already shaping future developments, even then.
Absolutely. Rivers like the Thames, the Severn, the Clyde, the Trent, they acted as natural highways, sources of food and water. And crucially, these waterways and the natural harbors influenced where major port cities would later emerge.
London, Bristol, Glasgow, Liverpool.
Exactly. Those locations became vital hubs for commerce, and centuries later for imperial expansion. Geography is destiny to some extent.
And what about their culture and languages during this pre-Roman period?
Linguistically, Celtic languages were spoken across much of Britain. These are the ancestors of modern Welsh, Scots Gaelic, and Irish.
And you can still see traces.
Oh yes, in place names. Even in regions that are now predominantly English-speaking, Pictish, spoken up in northern Scotland, is particularly interesting. It might have been a non-Indo-European language, something quite distinct.
Fascinating. And culturally.
Culturally, they practiced polytheistic religions centered on Celtic deities, and of course, the Druidic traditions we just discussed played a major role.
Okay, so we're getting a picture of diverse tribal societies, each with their own structures, trading, speaking different languages, distinct beliefs, all within a landscape profoundly shaped by geography and climate. Then, bam, the Romans arrive.
Indeed. The Roman conquest in 43 CE under Emperor Claudius signifies a fundamental shift, a real turning point in the political landscape.
They established the province of Britannia.
Right, mainly encompassing what we now know as England and Wales. And famously, they constructed Hadrian's Wall starting around 122 CE.
To mark the northern border.
Pretty much, to demarcate the northern limit of their direct control. Scotland, which they called Caledonia, remained largely beyond their rule despite numerous military campaigns trying to subdue it.
So what tangible changes did Roman rule actually bring to Britain? How did life change?
Well, it brought a complete overhaul of political and administrative systems. Roman law, Roman governance. It was a highly centralized, bureaucratic approach compared to the tribal structures before.
And they built towns. Proper Roman towns.
They certainly did. Urbanization was a key feature. Londinium, that's London. Of course, Eboracum, which is York. Aquae Sulis, modern Bath.
The baths, yeah.
Exactly. All featuring forums, bathhouses, amphitheaters, the classic signs of Roman urban life.
And these towns became hubs, didn't they, for the economy?
Crucial nodes in a more integrated, monetized imperial economy. You had villas, large agricultural estates producing food for the towns and for export. Roman coinage, Roman goods circulated widely.
Creating a different kind of society.
A more complex social hierarchy within the urban areas, yes, with distinctions between citizens, non-citizens, free individuals, slaves. Roman administration often worked through these cities, the civitates.
And the roads. You can still walk on parts of them.
An extraordinary feat of engineering. Initially built for the military for moving troops quickly.
But they became vital for everything else.
Absolutely. Vital arteries for trade, for communication. Their impact on the British landscape and infrastructure lasted for centuries, long after the Romans themselves had left.
And language.
Culture. Latin became the language of administration, of commerce. And while Roman religious practices, including eventually Christianity, were introduced, indigenous beliefs often persisted, especially out in the rural areas.
But the elites adopted Roman ways.
In the urban centers, certainly. Elite culture definitely adopted many Roman customs, architecture, literature, even entertainment.
But this Roman presence in Britain, it eventually came to an end, didn't it? It wasn't permanent.
No. The withdrawal was a gradual process, really, through the early 5th century. By 410 CE, the Western Roman Empire was facing huge pressures elsewhere.
Too stretched.
Exactly. Emperor Honorius famously, or perhaps infamously, advised the British communities to look to their own defense. That year, 410, is generally seen as the end of direct Roman administrative control over Britain.
Okay, so the Romans leave, power vacuum. What happens next? It sounds like a period of significant upheaval.
That's a fair assessment, yes. The post-Roman period saw considerable political fragmentation and the emergence of various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, Kent, Essex, Sussex, East Anglia.
A heptarchy, as it's sometimes called.
Broadly, yes. Though the reality was probably more complex and fluid than just 7 neat kingdoms, it was definitely a time of intense competition, shifting alliances, and eventual consolidation among these groups.
But what about the Romano-British people already there? Do they just disappear?
Not at all. It seems Romano-British communities, particularly in the west and north, maintained some Roman administrative and Christian traditions for a while. Archaeology even suggests continued life in some Roman towns, although often alongside significant economic decline.
Okay, so it wasn't an overnight switch. But this is when the Anglo-Saxons really become the dominant force in what becomes England. What were their early systems of governance like? How did they rule?
They developed monarchical systems where kingship was strongly tied to family lineage, but also, crucially, to military prowess and leadership.
So you had to be a good warrior.
It certainly helped. While kings were sometimes formally elected by assemblies of nobles, the Witan, essentially a council of important men.
Like a proto-parliament.
In a very, very early sense, perhaps. But succession generally tended to become hereditary within powerful families. We also see the early organization of land into shires.
Shires like Yorkshire, Hampshire.
Exactly. Administrative districts overseen by officials called ealdormen, and shire reeves, the origin of our modern sheriffs.
Be sheriff.
They also established systems of taxation, the beginnings of a bureaucracy, and importantly, legal codes. These codes often combined Germanic customary law with emerging Christian principles as conversion took place.
So we're seeing the early foundations of a more structured English state taking shape. And what about their economy and social structure? How did people live?
The economy was primarily agrarian. Wealth was largely measured in land ownership and livestock. However, important trading centers did begin to develop or redevelop, places like London, York, Southampton, facilitating exchange with the continent and, increasingly, with Scandinavia.
And society. Was it very hierarchical?
Very much so. You had the king at the top, then the things, a kind of warrior nobility, the ealdormen running the shires. Below them were freemen, known as churls, then guebers, a type of peasant tied to the land, and at the very bottom, slaves.
So quite rigid. Did that change much?
Well, one trend seems to be that over time, the rights and freedoms of the ordinary freemen, the churls, tended to decrease. They became less independent.
And the cultural and religious landscape must have undergone another dramatic transformation with the Anglo-Saxons settling and taking over.
Indeed. Christianity, which had gained a foothold during the Roman period but likely declined significantly after their withdrawal, was reintroduced in the late 6th century. It came from two main directions. You had the Roman mission, spearheaded by Augustine, which landed in Kent in the south in 597 CE. And then you had the Irish-Scottish mission, associated with figures like Columba, spreading Christianity from the north, from Iona.
So two different strands of Christianity initially.
Yes, with slightly different practices, which led to some debate, famously resolved at the Synod of Whitby in favor of the Roman practices. By the late 7th century, Anglo-Saxon England was largely Christian.
And this influenced their culture.
Profoundly. This era witnessed a flourishing of Old English literature and art. You get incredible works like Beowulf, poems like The Ruin, The Battle of Malden, often blending older Germanic heroic traditions with new Christian beliefs.
Beowulf, yeah.
And the developing church structures, monasteries, bishoprics also provided a degree of administrative and cultural continuity during a period of a lot of political instability.
We shouldn't forget the Celtic areas, though.
Absolutely not. It's crucial to remember that Britannic or Celtic cultural and linguistic traditions persisted strongly in the West, in what would eventually become Wales and Cornwall, and also in the North, in parts of Scotland. They weren't just wiped out.
Okay, so things are settling into a new pattern. Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Christianity spreading, and then you have the Viking incursions. That must have thrown everything up in the air again.
Absolutely. Starting in the late 8th century, you get renewed waves of Danish and Norse Viking invasions and settlements. It was a massive challenge.
How did the Anglo-Saxons respond? Did they just pay them off?
Sometimes. The payment of Danegeld, literally Dane money, was a tactic used, a form of tribute intended to buy peace. But it often proved counterproductive, maybe encouraging more raids.
So fighting back was also key.
Definitely. There was significant military resistance, most famously led by Alfred the Great in Wessex. Alfred didn't just fight back, he reorganized his military, built fortified towns, burghs, and really laid the groundwork for a more unified English kingdom capable of resisting.
Alfred the Great, a pivotal figure then.
Hugely important, though the struggle continued. For a period in the early 11th century, England actually became part of Cnut the Great's vast North Sea empire, linking it with Denmark and Norway.
Wow, so England was ruled by a Danish king.
Yes, Cnut. And interestingly, despite all the conflict, there were also elements of cultural exchange, assimilation, and even some underlying similarities between the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings in terms of social structures and warrior ethos.
So a period of fragmentation, settlement, conflict, conversion, and gradual hard-won unification, all leading up to that pivotal year we all learn about in school, 1066.
Yes, 1066, the Norman Conquest. It represents a truly profound and enduring turning point in English and therefore British history.
Yeah.
It wasn't just a change of king.
It changed everything.
It triggered a fundamental reshaping of England's political landscape, its social structure, its language, its culture. The effects were massive and long-lasting.
The disputed succession, right? 3 contenders for the throne: Harold Godwinson, the English Earl, William, Duke of Normandy, and Harold Hardrada, the King of Norway.
A dramatic year. Harold defeated Hardrada up north at Stamford Bridge, then had to rush south immediately.
Face William at Hastings. It's one of those dates etched in history.
And with very good reason. William's victory had a seismic impact. Almost immediately, you saw a significant replacement of the English ruling elite. Norman lords took control of vast English estates.
And they built castles everywhere, didn't they? To stamp their authority.
Exactly. A widespread program of castle construction, initially those quick Motte and Bailey earthwork and timber forts, later replaced by formidable stone fortresses, a very visible symbol of the new power structure.
And the way the country was governed underwent significant changes as well. How did the Normans rule?
Absolutely. Now, interestingly, the Normans were quite pragmatic. They adopted and adapted some of the existing Anglo-Saxon administrative systems they found useful, like the Shires, the royal treasury, the system of taxation, the use of writs.
So they didn't just throw everything out.
No, but they overlaid it with tighter royal control and introduced a much more formalized and rigid feudal system. Land ownership became directly tied to military service and loyalty owed to the king. That was fundamental.
And the legal system.
We also see crucial legal reforms under Norman and later Angevin kings like Henry VI and particularly Henry II. These reforms really laid the foundations for the English common law system, which is so influential globally.
And other changes.
Notably, the first significant Jewish communities began to arrive in England following the conquest, initially invited for their financial skills. And the church experienced a major shift too. Norman and French churchmen were appointed to top positions, bishops and abbots.
Integrating the English church more with the continent.
Yes, and integrating English monasteries more fully into the feudal system. They also initiated the rebuilding of many English cathedrals and major churches in the Norman Romanesque style, that solid, grand architecture, which later evolved into Gothic.
But this Norman takeover can't have been smooth. Was there resistance?
Oh, definitely. There were significant uprisings and resistance movements, especially in the early years. The most brutal suppression was in the north, the so-called harrying of the north, where William laid waste to huge areas.
Ouch.
And you had figures like Hereward the Wake leading resistance in the fens. Furthermore, Norman ambitions didn't stop at England's borders. Norman lords carved out powerful marcher lordships along the border with Wales, constantly pressuring the independent Welsh principalities. Scotland also felt increased continental and English influence during this period.
So while England was being dramatically transformed, what were the broader trends in governance and political evolution during the medieval period that followed?
While we witnessed the gradual evolution of Parliament, its roots are arguably in the Anglo-Saxon Witnagement, but it developed significantly through the Norman and later Plantagenet or Angevin eras.
And Magna Carta. That fits in here.
Absolutely. Magna Carta in 1215 is a landmark moment. Forced on King John by his barons, it established crucial principles, particularly the idea that even the king was subject to the law, limiting royal power. Hugely significant symbolically, if not always practically at first.
And how kings came to the throne. Did that change?
Royal succession increasingly followed the principle of primogeniture, the eldest son inherits. This became more established over time, reducing some, but certainly not all, succession disputes.
And the balance of power.
While royal estates were initially vast after the conquest, they gradually saw some fragmentation as kings granted land to powerful nobles to secure loyalty. It's interesting to recall that the increasing power of the great earls, the ealdormen, in the late Anglo-Saxon period had actually contributed to some of the instability that William exploited.
And the medieval period wasn't exactly a time of uninterrupted peace, was it? We mentioned resistance, conflicts with Wales and Scotland. What about later on? We get things like the Wars of the Roses.
Indeed not. Alongside the initial resistance and the ongoing conflicts on the borders, the later medieval period saw significant internal strife. This culminated in the Wars of the Roses in the 15th century that protracted bloody dynastic conflict between the rival branches of the royal family, the House of York and the House of Lancaster.
Which eventually led to the Tudors.
Exactly. Henry Tudor's victory at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485 brought the wars to an end and established the Tudor dynasty.
Now let's shift focus a bit. How did people actually live? What was the economy and society like in medieval Britain?
The economy remained overwhelmingly agrarian, organized around the feudal and manorial systems. The three-field crop rotation system became widespread in England, improving agricultural efficiency somewhat.
But towns were growing.
Yes, towns experienced significant growth as centers for trade and specialized crafts. These were often regulated by powerful guilds associations of merchants or artisans. Long-distance trade, particularly in valuable commodities like English wool.
Big business wall.
Yeah, huge business. Wool, tin, salt, connecting Britain to important economic centers in Flanders, France, the Hanseatic League in the Baltic. The introduction of feudal landholding, as we said, had a profound and lasting impact on social structures.
And you mentioned the enclosure movement starting.
We see the early stages in the later medieval period, yes. Landowners starting to fence off common land for their own use, often for sheep farming. This would accelerate dramatically in later centuries with huge consequences for rural communities, and things like the Statute of Labourers in 1351.
After the Black Death.
Precisely. It gives us a fascinating glimpse into the economic and social tensions after the plague drastically reduced the population. It was an attempt by the authorities to control wages and prevent workers demanding more pay now that labor was scarce. Didn't entirely work.
And what significant social changes occurred during this long medieval period? How did people perceive their place in the world? Did identity change?
Well, one interesting point is that the Norman Conquest seems to have led to a more defined, maybe more formalized set of rights and roles for women, especially widows from the landholding classes who gained clearer property rights, though societal expectations and pressure to remarry remained strong.
And the role of queens.
The growth of more complex, centralized governmental institutions gradually reduced the direct political influence queens sometimes wielded in earlier periods. Gender roles in agricultural labor also became perhaps more clearly defined.
And national identity. Did people feel English or Scottish?
We definitely see the development of stronger senses of distinct national identities. The English, particularly after losing territories in France, began to articulate a clearer sense of Englishness, often defining themselves against and feeling superior to the Welsh, Scots, Bretons, and later the Irish. But even within England, strong regional identities remained very important.
And religion continued to exert a powerful influence on daily life, I imagine. The church was central.
Absolutely central. The Norman and French churchmen, who rose to power after 1066, they adopted some existing Anglo-Saxon religious practices, but also introduced new Norman ones. Vast amounts of English land were granted to Norman monastic orders.
Like the Cistercians.
Yes, orders like the Cistercians became major landowners, integral to the feudal system. They played a significant role in land management, sheep farming, agricultural innovation, and the rebuilding of English cathedrals in the Norman Romanesque, and then the soaring Gothic styles.
Like Salisbury, York Minster.
Was a massive undertaking, reflecting the immense power, wealth, and cultural influence of the church. Pilgrimages to holy sites like Canterbury or Walsingham also became a widespread and important religious practice, connecting people across regions and linking Britain to broader European religious culture.
And how did people interact with their natural environment back then? What did medieval Britain look like?
It presented a diverse landscape. Broadly, you could characterize it as a more agriculturally focused south and east, and a more pastoral, hilly north and west, reflecting the underlying geography. Woodland cover was significantly more extensive than it is today.
More forests.
Yes, much more. And it's a reminder that even seemingly small changes, like the extinction of native bear populations probably by the 11th century and beavers by the 12th, reveal a shifting relationship between humans and the natural world.
Were the Roman roads still used?
Yes, the remnants of the Roman road network continued to be important routes, and rivers remained absolutely vital arteries for transportation and trade, far more so than today.
So from a collection of fragmented territories, we witnessed the consolidation of England under Norman rule, profound shifts in almost every aspect of life, all within the broader context of medieval Europe. This sets the stage for the next big phase, the Tudor and Stuart eras. More drama.
Oh, absolutely. The Tudor and Stuart periods, running roughly from 1485 to 1714, are characterized by hugely significant political and crucially religious upheaval. This is the era of the English Reformation.
Henry VIII and the break with Rome.
Exactly. The momentous break with the Roman Catholic Church under Henry VIII, the establishment of the Church of England. Though it wasn't a simple straight line, you had more Protestant reforms under his son Edward VI than a Catholic restoration under Mary Laffer.
Bloody Mary.
Before Elizabeth III tried to establish a middle way with the Elizabethan settlement. This period also saw a notable strengthening of the state's capacity for governance. Figures like Thomas Cromwell were key in improving administration.
And Parliament becomes more important.
Yes, Parliament's role expanded, partly because monarchs like Henry VIII needed its cooperation, especially for the Reformation legislation.
And this religious transformation wasn't exactly peaceful, was it? You mentioned upheaval.
Far from it. It triggered massive internal conflict and tension that lasted for generations. Most dramatically, it led to the English Civil War in the mid-17th century.
Parliamentarians versus royalists. Cavaliers and Roundheads.
A complex struggle over religious doctrine, the power of the king versus Parliament, culminating in the execution of King Charles I in 1649 and the subsequent period of the Commonwealth and Protectorate under Oliver Cromwell.
A republic, briefly.
Effectively, yes. Then came the restoration of the monarchy in 1660 with Charles II. But the underlying tensions about power and religion didn't just vanish. They eventually boiled over again in the Glorious Revolution of 1688-89.
When James II was overthrown.
Yes. This pivotal event led to William III and Mary II taking the throne, but crucially, it established a constitutional monarchy. Parliamentary supremacy was enshrined through key documents like the Bill of Rights and later the Act of Settlement. The power of the crown was significantly limited.
But there were still challenges to that settlement.
Oh, yes. You had the Jacobite Risings, several attempts, mainly from Scotland, to restore the exiled Stuart line to the throne, which continued well into the 18th century.
Alongside all this dramatic political and religious stuff, what was happening economically? Was Britain getting richer?
This era definitely witnessed substantial growth in overseas trade and the very beginnings of English colonial ventures. Think of the founding of the East India Company in 1600.
A huge player later on.
Immensely. Government policies known as mercantilism, like the Navigation Acts, were implemented to prioritize English shipping and trade, often at the expense of rivals like the Dutch. Financial institutions began to emerge too, with the establishment of the Bank of England in 1694 being a particularly significant development for stabilizing finance and funding government debt.
So the foundations of economic power are being laid.
Yes, the Tudor period saw a focused effort to build England's economic wealth. But we have to acknowledge that the early stages of colonial wealth generation were deeply, tragically entangled with the horrific transatlantic slave trade.
A crucial and dark part of the story. And how did English society itself evolve during these turbulent times? Who was gaining power?
We observe the continued rise and increasing political influence of the gentry, that class of landowners just below the nobility. They became very important, especially in parliament and local government. Religious tensions, as we've said, permeated society, leading to conflict, but also the emergence of various Protestant non-conformist movements, Puritans, Baptists, Quakers, later on challenging the established Church of England.
And culturally, it was a period of incredible flourishing, wasn't it? Despite all the turmoil.
Absolutely. The English Renaissance reached its zenith. You have the unparalleled flourishing of drama with figures like William Shakespeare, Marlowe, Ben Jonson.
The golden age of literature.
Many would call it that.
Religious debates also spurred significant intellectual developments, and the growth of pamphlet culture arguments played out in print. And we can't discuss 17th century London without mentioning the Great Fire of 1666.
Right, the Great Fire of London. It evokes such vivid imagery. What actually happened? What caused it to be so devastating? Well, it was a perfect storm, really. You had densely packed, timber-framed buildings, narrow streets, a long, dry summer, and reportedly a rather slow initial response in creating fire breaks. The Lord Mayor was apparently hesitant.
And the wind.
A strong, prevailing east wind fanned the flames, allowing the fire to spread incredibly rapidly across the city of London. It raged for days.
What were the consequences, besides the obvious destruction?
Massive social disruption. People lost homes, businesses. There was also scapegoating, sadly, aimed at foreign communities, particularly the French and Dutch, who were England's rivals at the time. But the rebuilding efforts, though slow, were substantial.
Did they rebuild differently?
Yes, crucially. The new regulations mandated wider streets and the use of brick and stone as primary building materials, not timber. Christopher Wren oversaw the rebuilding of dozens of churches, including St. Paul's Cathedral. Ultimately, the fire led to significant improvements in sanitation and fire safety in London.
A transformation born from disaster. And what about the impact on the environment during the Tudor and Stuart eras? Were there noticeable changes happening then?
Yes, we definitely begin to see more significant levels of resource exploitation. Growing industries, shipbuilding for the Navy and merchant fleet. They needed timber, fuel. It's the early stages, but it foreshadows the much more dramatic environmental impacts that were to come.
So the Tudor and Stuart eras laid many of the foundational stones for modern Britain, a constitutional monarchy, the beginnings of a global trading network and empire, significant cultural achievements, but also deep religious and political divisions. This leads us into the 18th and 19th centuries, a time of, well, even greater imperial expansion and the profound changes brought by the Industrial Revolution.
Precisely. The 18th and 19th centuries are truly defined by those two massive forces, large-scale imperial expansion and the transformative Industrial Revolution, plus significant social and political reforms. Britain rose to become a dominant global power.
How did that happen?
Through a series of expansionist wars like the 7 Years' War, the Napoleonic Wars, and crucially, through its unparalleled naval strength, the Royal Navy ruled the waves. This allowed the growth of the vast British Empire spanning continents, the Caribbean, India, Australia, Canada, large parts of Africa, Southeast Asia.
The empire on which the sun never set.
That was the boast. But we must always remember this period also involved the horrific peak of the transatlantic slave trade. Although significantly, growing moral and political pressure led to its abolition by Britain in 1807, followed eventually by the abolition of slavery itself throughout the British colonies in 1833. A long and hard-fought campaign.
And the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
It's hard to overstate just how much that reshaped Britain and ultimately the world, isn't it?
It was a period of truly fundamental, transformative change, beginning around the mid to late 18th century. Landmark technological innovations, James Hargreaves' spinning jenny, James Watt's improved steam engine, new processes for iron production like the blast furnace.
These changed everything.
They revolutionized key industries, textile manufacturing, coal mining, iron and steel production. This led to rapid, often chaotic, and unprecedented urbanization. Previously, small towns like Manchester, Birmingham, Glasgow, Liverpool exploded into major industrial centers.
And infrastructure had to keep up.
Infrastructure underwent massive expansion. First canals, then railways crisscrossed the country. The early telegraph systems started shrinking distances for communication. But it's crucial to remember this revolution wasn't uniform.
How so?
Its benefits and impacts were very unevenly distributed across Britain. You had the North and parts of the Midlands experiencing rapid industrialization, while the South remained largely agrarian. Ireland, under British rule, largely missed out on this industrial boom, and even experienced deindustrialization in some sectors, exacerbating poverty.
And this massive industrialization had enormous social consequences, didn't it? Fundamentally altering how people lived and worked.
Absolutely enormous. You see the rise of a modern industrial working class, the proletariat. A deepening of existing class divisions between the owners of capital and the workers. And, in response, the growth of organized labor movements, trade unions, campaigning for better conditions, and political reform.
Were there economic crises too?
Yes, the period was marked by significant economic downturns and social crises. The most devastating, arguably, was the Great Irish Famine in the mid-19th century, caused by potato blight but massively worsened by British government policy and landholding structures. Millions died or emigrated. Later, you had periods of depression impacting industrial areas.
And politically. We mentioned the Acts of Union earlier.
Yes, the Act of Union with Scotland in 1707 formally created Great Britain. Then the Act of Union with Ireland in 1801 created the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, abolishing the separate Irish Parliament in Dublin. Domestically, we also see a gradual, often painfully slow, but significant expansion of suffrage, the right to vote, throughout the 19th century.
Driven by pressure from below.
Very much so, fueled by movements like the Chartists and later reformers. Key milestones include the Great Reform Act of 1832, further reforms in 1867 and 1884 extending the vote to more men, the introduction of the secret ballot in 1872, though universal male suffrage only came in 1918.
So, a slow but steady march towards a more democratic system, at least for men. And how did daily life change for the average person during this period of intense change?
Well, rapid population growth, driven by falling death rates initially, and the pull of industrial jobs led to huge internal migration from the countryside to the new towns and cities, and also massive emigration, especially from Ireland and Scotland to the colonies, Canada, Australia, the U.S., often driven by poverty, famine, or lack of opportunity at home.
And family life. Gender roles.
Traditional gender roles were increasingly challenged and redefined by the demands of industrial labor, though often in complex ways, sometimes reinforcing domestic roles for women while men worked in heavy industry. You see the growth of both a wealthy industrial middle class, the bourgeoisie, and a vast urban working class.
Often living in tough conditions.
often living in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions in the rapidly expanding industrial cities. Think of the descriptions in Dickens' novels. The Victorian era also placed a strong emphasis on social respectability, family values, and a strict moral code, at least outwardly, often in stark contrast to the harsh realities of poverty, exploitation, and inequality.
What about the cultural and intellectual landscape of the 18th and 19th centuries? What ideas were shaping society?
The 19th century in particular witnessed significant religious revivalism. Methodism had already become a major force, and evangelical movements grew within the Church of England and beyond. Missionary movements also expanded alongside the empire.
And new philosophies.
Influential intellectual movements like utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number, Romanticism reacting against industrialization, and later, early Marxism began to offer powerful new ways of understanding society, politics, and the economy. And Victorian literature flourished, with novelists like the Bronte sisters, George Eliot, Thomas Hardy, as well as Dickens, vividly portraying the social changes, conflicts, and moral dilemmas of the era.
And the environmental costs of all this industrial progress must have been enormous.
They were indeed significant and increasingly recognized by some at the time. The large-scale extraction of resources, especially coal to fuel the factories and iron ore for manufacturing, led to widespread environmental degradation, scarred landscapes, spoil heaps.
And pollution.
Industrial pollution became a severe problem in the new urban centers. Air quality suffered massively from coal smoke. The infamous London fogs and rivers were often heavily polluted with industrial waste and sewage. The rapid development of infrastructure, canals, and especially railways also began to reshape the natural landscape on an unprecedented scale.
So the 18th and 19th centuries forged a Britain that was a dominant global power, fundamentally industrialized, undergoing profound social and political change, but also grappling with the very significant human and environmental costs of this rapid progress. This brings us right up to the 20th and 21st centuries, a period marked by world wars, the rise of the welfare state, the end of empire, and the shaping of the modern Britain we know.
Exactly. The 20th and 21st centuries have been a period of, well, immense global upheaval and equally dramatic domestic transformation for the UK. The two world wars had a truly profound impact.
In what ways?
From the sheer scale of mobilization and the horrific casualties, particularly in World War I, to the way the wars reshaped class structures, accelerated social change like votes for women, and ultimately contributed to the dismantling of the British Empire. World War II, in particular, with events like the Blitz, the bombing of British cities.
Forging a sense of national unity.
To a degree, yes. It demonstrated the resilience of the British population, fostered a sense of shared experience, and highlighted the UK's critical role, alongside its allies, in the eventual victory against Nazi Germany and the Axis powers. Intelligence breakthroughs, like at Bletchley Park, were also crucial.
And the aftermath of World War II saw the creation of the welfare state, a really fundamental shift in British society.
Yes, absolutely. The Labour government, led by Clement Attlee, elected in a landslide in 1945, implemented sweeping social reforms. This included the nationalization of key industries like coal, railways, and steel, and crucially, the creation of the National Health Service, NHS, in 1948.
Free healthcare at the point of use.
And a comprehensive welfare state providing social security from cradle to grave. This fundamentally altered the relationship between the government and its citizens, providing a social safety net on an unprecedented scale, building on earlier reforms.
And the vast British Empire, you said the wars contributed to its end.
Yes, the wars weakened Britain economically and militarily, and also fueled independence movements across the colonies. The post-war era witnessed a relatively rapid process of decolonization, starting significantly with Indian independence in 1947. Former colonies gained independence, sometimes peacefully, sometimes after conflict.
So Britain's global role changed dramatically.
Completely. Britain transitioned from being the center of a global empire to becoming, well, a leading middle power on the world stage. The Commonwealth of Nations evolved as a new voluntary association of former colonies and other nations. The UK also had to navigate its complex, special relationship with the rising superpower, the United States, while also engaging, sometimes hesitantly, with the process of European integration.
Which eventually led to joining the EEC, later the EU, and then leaving it.
Exactly. A path that ultimately culminated in Brexit. The concept of global Britain reflects ongoing efforts to define the UK's role and influence in the contemporary world post-Brexit and outside the EU framework.
And the British economy has continued to evolve dramatically in these modern times as well. No longer the workshop of the world.
No. We've seen significant neoliberal economic reforms, particularly starting in the Thatcher era in the 1980s. This involved large-scale privatization of previously nationalized industries, deregulation, and efforts to curb the power of trade unions.
A big shift from the post-war consensus.
A very big shift. And a post-industrial transition has occurred. A steep decline in traditional manufacturing industries like coal mining and heavy engineering, and a corresponding growth in the finance sector, especially in London services, and more recently, technology sectors.
Has it been smooth sailing economically?
Far from it. The UK has faced various economic challenges. The 2008 global financial crisis hit the UK hard, particularly its large banking sector, leading to bank bailouts and then prolonged periods of government austerity spending cuts. Contemporary economic challenges are significant, navigating the ongoing economic impacts of Brexit, addressing persistent issues of economic inequality and regional disparities between London's southeast and other parts of the UK.
And the green transition.
And the absolutely crucial transition towards a green economy, meeting climate change targets like achieving net zero carbon emissions. That's a massive undertaking.
And British society itself has become visibly much more diverse in recent decades.
Absolutely.
Oh.
Post-World War II immigration, initially from the Commonwealth countries, the Caribbean, South Asia, Africa, invited to help rebuild Britain and fill labor shortages, and later, significant migration from within the European Union after the UK joined. This has led to the emergence of a truly multicultural and multi-ethnic Britain.
Has that been straightforward?
It's brought huge benefits, but also challenges. Debates surrounding immigration levels, integration policies, multiculturalism versus assimilation, and promoting social cohesion continue to be significant, often contentious parts of public life.
And other social changes.
We've also witnessed substantial shifts in social norms and values, changing family structures with fewer traditional nuclear families, evolving gender roles with greater female participation in the workforce and public life. Significant progress in LGBTQ+ rights, from decriminalization to same-sex marriage. Alongside these changes, you have ongoing public discourse, sometimes very polarized, about race relations, systemic inequalities, historical memory, and evolving notions of British identity.
And politically, there have been some major structural shifts and ongoing debates, too.
Yes. A key development has been the devolution of power from Westminster. Starting in the late 1990s, legislative bodies with significant powers were established in Scotland, a parliament, and Wales and Northern Ireland assemblies.
Has this settled the issue of national identity within the UK?
Not entirely. It's granted greater regional autonomy, but has also fueled ongoing debates about national identity, particularly the rise of Scottish nationalism and the question of potential independence, and the complexities of power sharing in Northern Ireland post-Good Friday Agreement, and of course, Brexit.
The elephant in the room.
Brexit. The UK's withdrawal from the European Union following the 2016 referendum represents a fundamental constitutional and political watershed moment. Its consequences are still unfolding, affecting trade, politics, international relations, and even the internal dynamics of the UK itself.
So when historians look back at this incredibly long and complex story, nearly 1,000,000 years of it, how did they approach understanding and interpreting it all? What are the challenges?
Well, the field of history itself is constantly evolving, of course. There's a growing emphasis now on writing more inclusive historical narratives, striving to recover the experiences and perspectives of marginalized groups, women, working-class people, ethnic minorities, LGBTQ+ individuals who were often overlooked or silenced in traditional accounts focused on kings, queens, and great men.
Acknowledging the gaps.
Yes, acknowledging the gaps in our historical knowledge, particularly concerning prehistoric periods where evidence is scarce or the experiences of minority communities where written records might be fewer or biased. Ongoing research continues to explore really complex questions: the nature and evolution of the UK's political union, the long-term impacts and legacies of empire both at home and abroad, the challenges and opportunities of the post-Brexit economy, and the ever-fluid, contested nature of national identities.
So when we look back at it all, from those first footprints on the Norfolk coast to the complexities of 21st century Britain, it's been an absolutely astonishing journey.
Indeed it has. A journey marked by successive waves of migration, invasion, settlement, conquest, constant innovation, adaptation to changing circumstances, both internal and external. It's the intricate interplay, isn't it, of political systems evolving, social transformations, powerful economic forces, shifting cultural expressions, and the undeniable pressures and opportunities presented by the environment. All these have shaped the United Kingdom we recognize today.
And you, our listener, have now embarked on this deep dive with us, gaining, we hope, a comprehensive overview of this vast, intricate, and absolutely fascinating history.
So perhaps as a final reflection for you to consider, in a rapidly changing world, grappling with new challenges like climate change, technological disruption, shifting global power dynamics, how will the enduring legacies of this long and multifaceted past, the triumphs, the tragedies, the innovations, the divisions, continue to influence British identity and the UK's place in the future?
Which of the historical threads we've discussed resonate most strongly with you, and why? Perhaps this overview has sparked your curiosity to delve deeper into specific eras or themes. Roman Britain, the Reformation, the Industrial Revolution, the post-war era that particularly captured your interest.
Plenty to explore further.
Definitely. Plenty to ponder. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.